And so we're exploring these issues around masculinity, allyship, and sport in the context of an organised project that was based in the UK by a charity that sort of runs programs designed to promote inclusivity in and through sport. And I'll say a bit more about the project specifically in a moment. But what we're talking about primarily is men's sport and allyship. And we know that men, particularly privileged men, typically tend to be a lot less involved in allyship projects and programs than other groups. And there's been a few or various reasons for this pointed to in the research, including stigmatization or a fear of stigmatization from other men, something which Kehler describes as the key privilege of the powerful, which is obliviousness, as well as a general unwillingness to undercut our own positions of power and privilege. But obviously, if we want to effectively challenge things like gender-based violence, homophobia, transphobia, men do need to be engaged in that conversation, and that includes, or arguably should be, really centered on challenging aspects of masculinity which underpin or support or make people complicit in these kind of problematic and damaging attitudes and behaviours. Another note on that is that researchers have pointed to the fact that when men are engaged in social justice or allyship projects, certain systems of disempowerment, whether that's heteronormativity or cisnormativity or patriarchy, can often end up getting reproduced within those projects, which are designed to supposedly challenge those very things. So we've seen a lot of these issues around allyship and men play out in men's sports and specifically some recent events as well. So last year at the Men's World Cup, Football World Cup, we saw silence and silencing around issues of human rights, including women's rights and LGBTQ+ rights. In Canada recently, there was a scandal involving the sexual abuse of women and girls by the Canadians' junior men's hockey team. And also too often in not just Canadian context, but across sadly very all contexts, we see too often sexual abuse committed by university, school or college men's sports teams. And so these events really point to the fact that it's not just a couple of isolated incidents or a few bad apples, as some people might try and argue, but there's a problem with the culture around sporty masculinity itself, which is underpinned by misogynistic, homophobic and transphobic attitudes and behaviours. There has also been some kind of resistance, I guess, to this type of sporty masculinity, and researchers have pointed to a kind of resurgence in athlete activism in recent years, whether that's in response to the Black Lives Matter movements. In football, there's also Rainbow Laces campaign and a Rainbow Armband campaign, which at least offers some kind of symbolic support for marginalised groups. We can and should scrutinise whether those are really, how effective those acts are and whether they really go far enough. But we also think it's important to recognise that it does demonstrate that it is possible, or there is a possibility for sportsmen to speak out as allies and act as allies. And just a quick note on the way that allyship is conceptualized, not always, but too often, particularly in masculinity studies. It can be understood from the point of view of privileged groups and their relationships with marginalized communities. But of course, allyship is necessarily a relational activity that involves multiple people or multiple groups. So for example, if you ignore queer accounts of allyship and alliance building, then you miss out a huge part of how the development, the understanding, the experience of straight and queer alliances or allyships. So in our research, we're trying to think of it in terms of allyship between rather than allyship with. So that meant paying attention to straight or cisgender heterosexual accounts of allyship, as well as queer accounts. So this charity was a good context, these charity photo shoots were a good context for it. So this organisation invited queer and straight sportsmen to take part in nude photo shoots as part of a larger project designed to promote inclusivity in and through sport. So according to the charity itself, the purpose of this project is threefold. Firstly, it uses the images to create products like calendars, which it uses to raise funds and awareness for its inclusivity projects more broadly. It also claims to represent men in a more vulnerable and more intimate way, which it is designed to kind of undercut some of the problematic aspects of masculinity. And finally, the charity also purports to engage the participants in education and conversations around social justice and allyship and issues related to that. So the group that we spoke to was comprised of both cisgender heterosexual and queer sportsmen. Two of the participants did identify to us as gender fluid. We included them in this group of men in an inclusive way. Firstly, because the charity itself required identification as a man for participation in the photo shoots, but it was an understanding of manhood which is inclusive of both cis and trans experiences of that. So we include them here to firstly recognise the diversity of experiences of masculinity, and secondly, we include them with the understanding that for at least two of our participants, their identities are more complex than just men. So we spoke to participants in semi-structured interviews, and primarily we were interested in how masculinity and allyship were kind of constructed and possibly transformed through their participation in these photo shoots. So what we found is that the cis-het participants in particular found their participation a very educational, very transformative experience, and really shifted their understandings and enactments of allyship. For example, Charles, a cis-het participant, says, because of my involvement in this project, some people thought I was gay. My automatic reaction was to react aggressively, try and prove that I wasn't. But that's homophobic of me, and I shouldn't be scared of people calling me gay. So there's clearly like tension in his own account here of caring and not caring. But it does also show that he is some way through this project engaging in challenging some of his own heteromasculine responses to questions over his sexuality or his heterosexuality. Another quote from Fred, although for the sake of time, you can read it off the screen if you want to. And what these show is that the straight participants, there was this common narrative of participation in the shoots as a transformative experience around their kind of development and process of becoming allies. We did, however, see some noticeable limitations to these quite simplistic narratives of alliance building, and they really became clear from the queer participants' accounts or experiences of that allyship. So John, who identified to us as pansexual and gender fluid, says, I think I've struggled a little bit with some of this behaviour when they're challenging themselves to how many press-ups you can do. There's sort of a bit of a competitive element, and I didn't feel particularly comfortable around that. It's part of my own challenge of being around sporting people. When it's that competitive sort of how big are your muscles, how strong, I don't find that a particularly safe space. So here we can see how a kind of physical competitiveness, which is very typical of sporting and sporty masculinity, evidently still kind of permeates this space, which is supposedly inclusive and is also evidently exclusionary, making for John this space not a particularly safe one. We also saw another example of this, Mikey, a cisgender gay participant who basically described some cis het participants making jokes about going on safari tour in a gay sauna where they were doing one of the photo shoots. And this is something which Mikey had to confront and challenge during the photo shoot. So what this kind of points to then is that when we're paying attention to the queer participants' accounts, things like this physical competitiveness and the hetero and cis normativity of conventional sporty masculinities does still permeate this photo shoot space, disrupting those already kind of overly simplistic ideas of allyship that we saw initially. We do want to also offer a kind of a reading of these limitations and these ideological collisions as having some potentially productive possibilities for unlearning how to do allyship. And so in this case, we're drawing on Hatton Warren's work around racism and racial privilege in educational settings, where they found that the expression of kind of under the surface, under-examined ideas did make it, kind of brought them to the surface in a way that actually made them challengeable in a way that they weren't previously. So what we saw is when there was these moments of like hetero-masculine behaviour, the group, particularly the queer participants, also were able to challenge that and turn them into moments of like learning and education, which we saw in last quote from Mikey. He didn't just challenge it, but was able to educate and inform as a result. And this did have an effect on the straight, sporty men's understandings of allyship, where in contrast to those quite simplistic narratives, they also demonstrated at times a greater understanding of the complexity and the difficulties of allyship. For example, saying, demonstrated how difficult allyship is. It's easy to say that you want to be an ally or that you are an ally, but actually the act of being an ally means challenging aspects of your behaviour through that allyship. So just to sum up then briefly, we were trying to balance, to a certain extent, kind of more critical and more sympathetic readings of this photo shoot project. In some ways it's quite easy to dismiss the straight participants' quite simplistic and arguably quite naive understandings of allyship, which was shown to be just that, simplistic and naive, when we looked at the queer participants' experiences of that allyship. But it did also represent a desire and a willingness to learn about allyship and kind of question their own masculinities and the damaging aspects of that to a certain extent. And it also means that when they were challenged, they were sort of engaged in that conversation already, which kind of was almost like meeting halfway and balancing the issues around the burden of education with the importance of being accountable to affected groups. So ultimately for us then, it kind of points to two things. First, it highlights the need to conceptualize allyship in terms of between rather than just with, which is an issue in masculinity studies, as I mentioned. And secondly and finally, it speaks to the need for these mixed sexuality, mixed gender groups when it comes to developing allyship amongst men, because it allows for developing a form of allyship that doesn't ignore the difficulties and the challenges of that process, and really recognizing that allyship needs to be based on challenges and challenging, as much as it is based on care. Nothing. Thank you very much.
Any question? Yeah.
So, I don't know if this is a dumb question, but did you feel like there was almost a sense of like capacity for allyship also based on almost like an in-group hierarchy? Because like when I'm looking at the photo shoot, you'd have to be confident, let's say, like a sub-capacity to maybe engage with it. So maybe folks that like was there anything really almost like, if you were like top of the pack in this sports hierarchy, you might be more likely to engage in allyship because you are more confident like in yourself than people like you, whatever. Whether it's maybe if you're not confident, you wouldn't want to rock the boat. Like, does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, it does, yeah. Well, there was definitely issues with the project in the sense of you can question the extent that you can really challenge masculinity in the context of a project that's based on sporty men, because you can see from the pictures they were pretty like conventional, very like white, able-bodied, athletic men. So it's like, how disruptive is that really to masculinity? And so to answer your question, I mean, really, if people were unconfident or didn't necessarily feel comfortable being naked on camera, they weren't even being part of the project in the first place. So it was kind of, in terms of the hierarchy of men, it's really a project that problematically in some ways really just focused on quite conventionally masculine men, if that makes sense? So ones that are arguably at the top of the hierarchy already, as it were. So yeah, I mean, it's a good point because it speaks to a fundamental issue with the project itself. Yeah.
I probably missed in the beginning when you mentioned, but were you just looking at white men? Because I see all the pictures, they were mostly these white bodies. I was wondering to what extent did race play a role?
Yeah.
Why we selected
well, the selection for us, the participants kind of self-selected really. They self-selected by volunteering for the project in the first place, and the project, going back to what we were just saying, has these issues of being a very homogenous group of men, able-bodied, white, athletic, all identified as pretty like middle or upper class as well. So the project itself is a very white orientated project, I guess, or it doesn't aim to be, but clearly there is an issue with that, something to do with the way that it markets itself or engages its participants. And then they also self-selected by, we just said we're doing this research, join if you want to, kind of thing. So it was kind of, it's already quite a homogenous group of men, and then the people that decided to take part in our research, almost then it kind of even condenses that even further and speaking to the same issues.
So it attracted mostly white men.
Right, it did, yeah, exactly, yeah. Yeah.
So I started sports when I was very young, and there was still intense masculinity as a subject when I was 5 years old. So how would you challenge such an issue with the same kind of techniques, but since they're children, it seems almost difficult to deal with? Do you have any ideas of how one would challenge it?
Challenge like conventional masculinities through sport, you mean?
Yeah, it's starting younger and making it easier so when they're older it can be less of a topic.
Well, I mean, having the conversation for starting, it sounds like an obvious thing, is important. Also, I mean, it is difficult. It requires quite a fundamental shift in the way that sport is organised from the bottom up, which, at school is like one of, if not the only subject, which is like divided in a very like cisgenderist way between like boys and girls kind of thing, which you just don't get in other subjects. So straight away, it's sort of like embedded in the culture, this kind of problematic ideas around gender and therefore also sexuality. So not an easy answer really for it, but it requires like a real shift from across loads of different contexts, the way that we understand sport to be organised, shifting away from ideas of it being like competitive, right? In PE, it doesn't need to be like, we're going to go play football, and it's like, we're desperate to win kind of thing, instead of it being like about developing physical literacy rather than, being competitive, is another thing that's difficult to dislodge, right? But it's for me the most important step to avoiding some of the issues that you're talking about. If that answers your question. Not really, but yeah. Oh, sorry.
Yes, you used the word confident to describe these young men, these sporty boys.
Yeah.
I'm curious though, it seems the common thread is not confidence, is actually that competition. It seems born in fear of not being enough. Mm-hmm. Do you recognize fear as being significant in any way, even if it was not verbalized?
Definitely, and you're right that it actually was verbalized. Like even though the men that were part of this, as we say, clearly are like able-bodied and athletic men, they did express kind of body dissatisfaction and nervousness about taking part in the project. So it definitely was an issue. Like insecurities were on the surface, but it was also things that they were able to kind of like overcome, as it were, right? And I think that they're kind of the capital that they have, the social capital, as being like elite sporty men, makes it easier to overcome those insecurities to a certain extent. That makes sense. Yeah.